Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and your host for the program. Each week we talk about issues, public policy issues that are very important. We hope you'll talk about those same issues. And then at election time, you'll be ready and willing to go vote. Our guest for this program is Tracy Hightower-Henne. She's the Executive Director of the Nebraska Innocence Project. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk about the Innocence Project. I think if some of our viewers have heard of it, they may know it from the Netflix series Making a Murderer, or they've heard it from other cases. But tell us about the Innocence Project and how did it start? How long has it been in existence?
Sure. So the Innocence Project started really in New York, and it started about 25 years ago. And now it's really warped into projects all over the country. So in Nebraska, we have our Nebraska Innocence Project, and we're part of a national innocence network. And so we really collaborate a lot on cases and help each other out with ideas and different types of advances in DNA testing or policy changes. So we look at cases in our Nebraska Innocence Project of potential innocent inmates and review them to decide if there's anything that can be done to exonerate.
Okay. And I think you mentioned DNA testing and significance. What is the significance of DNA in legal proceedings? And tell our viewers, some people might not know, what is DNA?
Sure. So DNA is everything that makes up the individual characteristics that we have as human beings, and it's really the gold standard of forensic science. So it's the only thing forensically in criminal cases that is backed in science. And so when you think about, sometimes you hear DNA testing shows that it's 1 in a bazillion chance that it's someone else. And that's the only type of standard of testing that has that prejudicial value as to all others. And when we talk about other types of forensic science that we hear sometimes on CSI or on TV, it's not always the gold standard, and sometimes it's very subjective as to the test results or how it's compared one to the other. For example, hair comparison testing has been really brought into question lately as well. So that's very different because it means a forensic science examiner is comparing one hair sample to another as opposed to DNA testing, which is very much based in science and gives us those numbers that we can sort of wrap our mind around that it's potential. Yeah.
Okay. Why did you mentioned that you have a national organization project, so why don't you explain the different levels of the Innocence Project? How does it all fit together between states and national?
Sure. Mostly we are all separate 501c3s. Some different projects are housed in maybe a law school and maybe a law school clinic. So in Nebraska, we are a separate 501c3. We are part of a regional organization called the Midwest Innocence Project through Kansas City. We are one of 5 states of the Midwest Innocence Project, so we work very closely with the staff at the Midwest Innocence Project, including litigating cases together.
Okay. And Nebraska and Iowa sort of had they sort of started with the Free the Innocence Project. Is that where it all began, kind of in these two
Yes.
states?
I think I might have still been in high school when that happened.
Okay.
And so Iowa and Nebraska started together, and shortly before I started volunteering, the decision was made that the states were large enough in size that it made sense for us to each be separate. So we, out of all amicableness, decided to be separate, and so Iowa has its own Innocence Project as well as Nebraska.
Okay.
So Iowa is one of the states that's within the Midwest Innocence Project.
Okay. And tell us about your legal background and experience and how you got interested in getting involved with the Innocence Project.
Yeah, so I went to law school, and sadly, the law school I went to in Michigan at Cooley Law School has an amazing Innocence Project clinic. And I had no idea what the Innocence Project was about in law school, and if I could go back, I would be in that clinic. I had a different direction in law school, and I thought that tax law was really exciting. So I have a master's in tax law as well as my JD, and I took a job out of law school. And I was bored with it, I think we could say, with a great company, and I decided that I really wanted to do something that I felt made a difference, and I started volunteering with the Nebraska Innocence Project. That was the thing that I chose to do something different, and I think that decision really opened my eyes that I didn't want to be at that corporation, and I wanted to do bigger things. So I decided to quit there, and I've been working with the Innocence Project in Nebraska for about 9 years now.
Okay. And you also teach at Creighton Law?
Yes.
Telling me?
Yes, so I'm an adjunct professor at Creighton Law School teaching wrongful convictions. So law school students come and learn about the reasons for wrongful convictions, and we go pretty in depth about the history and where we are now and all of that.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about Nebraska history. Wrongful convictions, it's not anything new. It's not a modern day problem. And there's, can you say a little bit about, there's a first documented state case with someone named William Marion, and what happened with that? When was that?
Yes, so the Marion case is actually the very first case we talk about in class, and it just so happened to be the first case in the textbook that is a national textbook, but it's interesting that it's a Nebraska case. So that was from the late 1800s, and a man named William Marion was traveling and ended up coming back to Nebraska after leaving Nebraska with a friend, and his friend didn't come back with him. So there was a skull that was found in a desert, and they thought it was his friend's, and they ended up executing Marion for what they thought was the murder of his friend Cameron. And several years later, Cameron came up back to Nebraska alive and well, and to the shock of many, they realized that they had executed an innocent person and that there was actually no death. So that is the start of many states' ideas of what happened with wrongful conviction, and it happened here in Nebraska.
Here in Nebraska.
Yes.
Okay. Another Nebraska case that I know we wanted to talk about was the Juniel Pratt case. So why don't you tell our viewers about that particular one? It's gone on a long time.
It has. When I started volunteering with the Nebraska Innocence Project, several seasoned volunteers said, you have to look at this case, and so I've been working on it ever since. And Juniel was convicted in 1975 in Omaha of rapes, and his case has been through the ringer of almost everything we could try on an Innocence Project case, including requests for DNA testing, which we ultimately were granted after about 3 years in appeals. We did the DNA testing, and as many of the DNA exonerees, they are the lucky few. It takes several things to happen for DNA exonerations to occur, and that's first, the testing or the evidence has to be available and stored and preserved properly. And that was probably the first downfall for Juniel's case, is that many of the items of evidence had been missing or had gone away at some point, and so they weren't available even to test. So we went ahead with trying to test it, and it ultimately wasn't exculpatory enough results. And so we've been through requesting parole for him, requesting commutation for him. He is still incarcerated. He's been there for 42 years. So he was 19 when he went in, and he's 62 now. So it's just really interesting. And it's one of those cases that will kind of always sit with me for forever.
Okay.
Yeah.
So has it completely worked its way through the courts? It's basically his only option now is parole?
That's true.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's part of the kind of the sadness that goes along with some of these cases.
Yes, they're very difficult. After a person is convicted and we're in the post-conviction stage, it's really an uphill battle. Any evidence that we bring really has to overturn the conviction of, what happened at the trial, and that's difficult to do.
Okay. Well, let's move to another Nebraska case where there was evidence that could overturn things. It's pretty widely known about the Beatrice 6. So talk about that case.
So that case is our Nebraska exoneration, DNA exoneration case. It was not through the Nebraska Innocence Project. The Beatrice Six thankfully have a team of very amazing attorneys that worked really hard to exonerate them, and now through compensation, and they're still fighting for compensation. Their case was one of those lucky DNA cases where the stars aligned. All of the DNA evidence was stored properly in order to be tested. So there were a lot of things that really went in their favor as far as actually being exonerated. Ultimately, their case really comes down to several of the different reasons for wrongful convictions, and it's false confession is one of them. They were led to believe that they were at the crime scene, and there was the odd idea of dream therapy that happened with them in order to believe that they were there and ultimately falsely confess. And there's also, their case is wrought with government misconduct, and that's the level of the trial they're at now is trying to prove that it was gross misconduct in order to receive federal compensation. So that case in Nebraska, it's really shown, I think, the citizens that it happens in Nebraska, and it did very much so, in the sense that 6 people were convicted of a crime that 1 person did.
Right.
And really knowing the details of that case is very scary.
And in that case with the 6 people, 5 of them actually basically were coerced into admitting that they'd done it. The sixth one never did.
That's right.
So he always claimed that, no, I'm not guilty, I didn't do this.
That's right, yeah. Joseph White stood his ground and went to trial, and he also was the one that started the exoneration process as well.
Okay. So okay.
Yeah.
And then most recently in the news has been the Antoine Young case. So if you would talk, you can tell us some about that. I mean, that's in the court. So for whatever you can tell us about that particular case.
Sure. So I can't talk a whole lot about it because it is a pending litigation case right now. But recently what was in the news is that DNA testing was ordered in that case, and we're happy that, you know, we will potentially have some results that could be exculpatory for our client. He is serving a life sentence for first-degree murder that happened in Omaha in 2007. And so we have been working on his case, investigating and looking for new evidence that could potentially, outside of DNA, that could also potentially lead to his exoneration. So we're hoping that he's one of the lucky few that DNA evidence could potentially exonerate him as well. And when we get those results, and it will be an exciting moment.
How long does it typically take for, once the testing has been authorized, how long does it typically take to get results back?
Sometimes it depends on the backlog of what may be happening in the crime lab. We won't get a whole lot of priority if there's, you know, a pending murder trial that could be coming up or something like that. It could be a couple of weeks to maybe a couple of months, which in court time is pretty quick.
Okay, all right. And you talked about some of the, besides DNA, some of the other things that can contribute to a wrongful conviction. The evidence or inadequate defense, what other issues, and does race of the person make a difference in these cases?
Yeah. So the top reasons for wrongful convictions, the first one is eyewitness misidentification, and that's been seen in about 3/4 of the DNA exonerations. We also have false confessions, which is the second most leading cause of wrongful convictions. We also have unvalidated forensic science, so that's really anything that's not DNA evidence that was used to convict a person. We also have incentivized informants, also known as the jailhouse snitch. So that's a really interesting concept as well, which is very difficult to prove on an exoneration. And then there's government and prosecutorial misconduct, as well as bad lawyering in general or ineffective assistance of defense counsel. So all of those things, and often cases are a combination of several of those things.
Well, Beatrice Six certainly was, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they can be very complicated then.
They can be very complicated.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about in the first case in Nebraska, the one that's so kind of famous in the Morris case, or Marion case. Let's talk about the death penalty and wrongful convictions. What, now that Nebraskans have voted to reinstate it, whether or not that's going to happen anytime soon, given the drug issues, we don't know, but what does that mean for cases in the Innocence Project or wrongful conviction cases?
Well, the bigger picture is just by having the death penalty, there's the risk of executing an innocent person. And we were so happy when the legislature voted to abolish the death penalty, because that meant that we would never have to worry about an innocent person being executed. Mm-hmm. And nationally, there's been over 150 people that have been exonerated from death row. So we know that it happens, and it's potential that it's happened, and innocent people have been executed. And we know that Marion in Nebraska in the late 1800s was executed. And often people will argue that it's different and times are different, but that was a case that truly was based on unvalidated forensic science, based on the idea they thought the skull was the victim's, and there was no victim. So it's very scary that just having the death penalty has that risk involved. With the Beatrice 6, for example, the other problem with having the death penalty on the books is that it's used as a threat to gain a false confession, and that is what happened in the Beatrice 6. So we like to think that if there wasn't a death penalty, that law enforcement wouldn't be able to use that as a threat to gain a false confession.
Okay. Well, we talked a little bit about wrongful conviction cases relying on DNA, but there are also these the other issues. In particular, is there anything that in particular that distinguishes cases where DNA doesn't really play much of a role?
You know, there's several different reasons that a person could be exonerated, or different ways, DNA obviously being one of them. And because it's more difficult to have DNA available, the numbers are, there are 2,006 national exonerations to date, and that includes the DNA, which are only 349 of those. So we have a good amount that are non-DNA exonerations as well. And Nebraska has 3 non-DNA exonerations on top of the Beatrice 6. So we look at certain things such as just newly discovered evidence that really couldn't have been known and wasn't known at the time of trial. Sometimes it's a recantation of a witness that may have testified and lied. So there's several different ways that it could be a non-DNA case. Okay.
And would you say those are more difficult to deal with, to prove?
Yes, absolutely. They're much more difficult and much more expensive to litigate. Okay.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned expense, because it is expensive, you said before, to try and one of the cases and go back. How do you pay for the legal expenses of helping someone overturn their conviction?
So because we are 501c3 and the Midwest Innocence Project is as well, we're through donations and grants. The Midwest Innocence Project just got a federal grant to work specifically on hair comparison review cases in Iowa, and so we're hoping to learn a lot of what they found there and instill that in Nebraska. So donations and grants is basically how we survive. So the average cost of a non-DNA exoneration is about $300,000 from start to finish to exonerate someone.
So it's very expensive. Yes. And how do you decide which particular cases to take? I'm sure that you have a lot of applicants.
Yes. So we have a very lengthy application that an inmate fills out. We have several criteria in order to actually make the next step or for us to investigate further. And that is that they have to be claiming actual innocence. So they have to be saying that they got the wrong person and it was not me that was there. They also have to no longer be on any sort of appeal of their conviction and no longer be eligible for a court-appointed counsel. The other interesting criteria is that they have to have at least 7 years left on their sentence. And the
Oh,
purpose,
why is that?
the purpose for that is that's about the average amount of time it takes to exonerate someone from the time that they first apply.
7 years.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So I know that you do work with students at the various law schools locally, UNL, Creighton, and College of St. Mary's students as well. So would you talk about how they fit into the work and how they help on the cases?
Sure. We have students who review cases, and a lot of the review on our cases, if an inmate passes those initial criteria, then we look at their transcripts, their police reports, which sometimes can be very lengthy. So students can get really good review, especially in the law schools, of looking at actual transcripts from a criminal conviction.
Mm-hmm.
So reviewing those transcripts and police reports is a really big part for students to work on with us. We also just have administrative work that needs to be done, which is also a really good learning experience, being in the legal community as well. We've had paralegals from the College of St. Mary's working on case review and application intake and some administrative social media and website, things like that.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about overturning wrongful conviction, but let's go to the point of how do we prevent it, focus on preventing it to start with. What kinds of things have you worked on or the Innocence Project worked on to change our policy or procedures to prevent these kinds of convictions?
Yeah. So one of our parts of our mission in Nebraska is to make the criminal justice system better, and that's through policy work that we've done in the past. Nebraska has some pretty good policy on our books, which we're pretty proud of, but this last year we were very excited that the legislature passed our bill, which requires law enforcement to have the best practices for eyewitness identification in place. And that includes things such as how a lineup is conducted, the types of instructions that happen at a lineup, the confidence statement that a witness might sign after making an identification. And all of those things are parts of why eyewitnesses had misidentified someone, and that's one of the top reasons for wrongful conviction. So we are happy that hopefully that will prohibit a wrongful conviction in the future by having those best practices in place. We also did a little bit of change or cleanup, I might say, to the DNA Testing Act that has been in place since 2001 in Nebraska. And we expanded really the access to DNA testing, and that's what led to Antoine Young's DNA motion being granted. And so we're really happy to see that full circle just happen recently after some work in the legislature.
And when you say expanding the access, what does that include?
So the initial DNA Testing Act had a requirement that we had to show, in order to get DNA testing granted, that we had to show the DNA testing wasn't available at the time of trial. That really excluded any cases after the mid-90s or the early 90s, and so we were really afraid that any cases or applicants that came to us where their conviction was after 1990, we couldn't do anything. So that requirement is no longer a requirement. We just now have to show that DNA testing wasn't done, and that's exactly the change that we needed just in order to ask for testing again in his case. Okay.
So that was really helpful. Anything else in terms of legislature or that you think we need to do in Nebraska that in the future we need to change? I mean, we were talking earlier that Nebraska is really pretty good in terms of our statutes that help protect against wrongful conviction.
Yeah.
But what else do we need to do?
There's always room for change. There's always room to make it better. We have a pretty good compensation statute, which was actually instilled as a result of the Beatrice 6. There were several things that weren't included in that bill that we had proposed for the Beatrice 6, such as other benefits that they really should have been given and not just compensation. So we would love to go back and clean that up. And based on really what the Beatrice 6 has faced in light of not receiving those benefits.
And compensation, you mean monetary, you mean money given to them?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. We also are looking at potentially a statute that talks about prosecutors keeping track of every time they used an incentivized informant or a snitch, and so that we can ask for that information in discovery and learn, is this person potentially an actual incentivized informant, in order to use that as newly discovered evidence for an exoneration.
Okay.
So that might be the next thing coming up in policy, which is a very interesting line of cases that had been a result of incentivized informants. And that's one of the leading causes of wrongful conviction, so we hope that we can help clean that as well.
Okay. Is there anything else that we can do as private citizens to be aware of in terms of helping to ensure that we don't have wrongful convictions?
That's a great question. I think just always educating yourself on the fact that our criminal justice system isn't perfect. We've tried really hard, I think, as a country to make it the best that it can be, but it is infallible and it's a human system. And so I think always keeping an open mind that it's possible that we may have convicted an innocent person, and we might think that, or we should think that it can happen, and it has happened in Nebraska. Yeah.
Okay. And if someone wanted to, or a viewing audience wanted to get involved with the Innocence Project, besides donations of money, which I'm sure you could use donations for it, what else could we do? I mean, do you need to help review cases? Do you need to be a lawyer? Do you ever have just volunteers who aren't necessarily legally trained help?
Yes, we have several lay people that enjoy case review very much. It sometimes is like reading a crime novel, sometimes not so much. So it can be exciting doing case review. It is time consuming. So if anyone does have time that wants to do case review, I can train them on how to do that. I think sometimes educating the public is really helpful. So if anyone has a group that they need a speaker for, we can come and speak and talk about some really exciting things.
And give us your contact information in case there is someone who would like to look into volunteering.
Sure. So all contact can be through our website, the NebraskaInnocenceProject.org, or the Midwest Innocence Project at, which is the MIP.org.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Tracy, thank you so much for being with us and talking about the Innocence Project.
Thank you for having me.
Great work.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, for the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote, Omaha.